The morning sun cast golden rays through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, carefully examined the delicate christening gown laid out on the four-poster bed. The ivory silk and Huntington lace garment had witnessed history for nearly 2 centuries, having been worn by generations of royal babies since Queen Victoria's eldest daughter first donned it in 1841. William stood beside her, his usually confident demeanor softened by the weight of the moment. Their 3-month-old son George Alexander Louis slept peacefully in his cot, blissfully unaware that he would soon become the center of one of the most anticipated royal ceremonies in recent memory. The future king's tiny fingers curled around the edge of his blanket, and Catherine couldn't help but smile at how ordinary he looked despite being anything but ordinary. "He's grown so much since we brought him home," Catherine whispered, reaching down to gently stroke George's cheek. The baby stirred slightly but remained asleep, his breathing steady and calm. William nodded, remembering those first overwhelming days after George's birth when photographers camped outside the hospital and the world waited for their first glimpse of the newest member of the royal family. The preparation for this day had begun weeks ago. Palace staff had meticulously planned every detail, from the flower arrangements to the security protocols. The Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace had been chosen as the venue, the same intimate space where William himself had been baptized 31 years earlier. The circular chapel, with its ornate ceiling and rich history, could accommodate only 22 guests, making this one of the most exclusive royal events in decades. Catherine's mother, Carol Middleton, arrived early that morning with an armload of carefully pressed linens and a nervous energy that betrayed her excitement. Despite having been part of the royal family for over 2 years, she still felt the magnitude of these ceremonial occasions. She had spent the previous evening with her daughter, sharing stories about William's own christening and offering the kind of maternal support that only a mother could provide. "The photographers will want pictures of him arriving," Carol said practically, smoothing down the christening gown one final time. "But they'll have to wait behind the barriers. Security has been quite thorough about the arrangements." Catherine appreciated her mother's grounding presence. Carol had a way of treating even the most extraordinary circumstances as manageable family moments. Meanwhile, across London, other members of the royal family were making their own preparations. Queen Elizabeth II, now 87 years old, had insisted on attending despite her increasingly limited public appearances. Her lady-in-waiting had selected a powder blue coat and matching hat, colors chosen specifically to complement the solemn nature of the occasion while maintaining the dignity expected of the sovereign. Prince Charles arrived at Clarence House that morning in high spirits, genuinely delighted to witness his first grandchild's baptism. He had been looking forward to this day since George's birth, seeing it as both a family milestone and a constitutional moment. As the baby's grandfather and future king, Charles understood the symbolic importance of welcoming George formally into the Church of England, of which he would one day be the supreme governor. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, had spent considerable time preparing for the ceremony. Having only recently been appointed to his position, this would be one of his first major royal engagements. He understood the delicate balance required, creating a meaningful spiritual moment while acknowledging the intense public interest and historical significance of baptizing a future king. At Kensington Palace, the final preparations were taking place with military precision. Catherine's hair had been styled in her signature loose curls, and she wore a cream-colored Alexander McQueen coat dress that struck the perfect balance between formal and maternal. William donned his navy suit, the same shade he had worn to their wedding, though he admitted to Catherine that he felt far more nervous about holding his son during the ceremony than he had about saying his vows in front of 2 billion viewers. The christening gown had its own fascinating history that added weight to the morning's preparations. The original Victorian gown had become too fragile for regular use, so in 2008, the Queen had commissioned an exact replica. The new gown maintained every detail of the original: the intricate Huntington lace, the flowing train, the delicate sleeve work. George would be the 4th royal baby to wear the replica, following the footsteps of his father, Uncle Harry, and cousin Peter Phillips. As the departure time approached, the palace buzzed with quiet efficiency. Security personnel conducted final sweeps of the route to St. James's Palace, while household staff ensured every detail of the ceremony had been confirmed. The Lily Font, a magnificent silver-gilt basin commissioned by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, had been moved from the Tower of London to the Chapel Royal, where it would hold water from the River Jordan, a tradition dating back to the Crusades. Catherine lifted George from his cot, marveling again at how small he seemed in her arms. The christening gown, despite being tailored to fit him perfectly, still seemed to engulf his tiny frame. She had dressed countless babies during her charity work, but holding her own son on such a significant day filled her with an emotion she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about royal protocol or public duty. This was about welcoming their child into their faith and their family's traditions. William checked his watch and nodded to the waiting staff. The cars were ready, the route was secure, and their guests were already beginning to arrive at St. James's Palace. In just a few hours, their son would officially become not just Prince George, but a baptized member of the Church of England, taking his first formal step on the path that would eventually lead him to the throne. The couple shared a quiet moment before leaving their private apartments, looking down at their sleeping son and, then, at each other. Whatever challenges lay ahead in their public life, whatever pressures came with raising a future king, this moment belonged to them as a family. The weight of history and the intensity of public scrutiny would wait just a little longer as they savored these final private moments before stepping into their very public roles as parents to a prince. The black Range Rover pulled away from Kensington Palace at precisely 10:30 in the morning, its tinted windows offering the Cambridge family a brief respite from the telephoto lenses already trained on their route. Catherine sat in the back seat, George cradled carefully in her arms, while William rode alongside, constantly checking his phone for updates from the palace security team. The London streets, normally bustling with morning traffic, had been subtly cleared along their route, though casual observers might not have noticed the careful orchestration that made their journey possible. George remained remarkably calm during the short drive, his dark eyes taking in the filtered sunlight streaming through the windows. Catherine spoke softly to him, pointing out landmarks they passed, Buckingham Palace in the distance, the Wellington Arch, the familiar red brick of St. James's Palace growing larger as they approached. William watched his wife and son with quiet amazement, still adjusting to the reality that this tiny person would someday inherit the crown he himself would wear. Outside St. James's Palace, a carefully controlled scene was unfolding. Unlike the massive crowds that had gathered for the royal wedding or would later assemble for major Jubilee celebrations, today's audience was deliberately intimate. A small group of well-wishers had gathered behind barriers, many holding cameras and small Union Jack flags. Royal protection officers maintained a discreet but visible presence, their earpieces crackling with constant communication updates. The media presence was equally restrained but highly professional. A designated pool of photographers had been positioned to capture the arrival and departure, while television cameras prepared to broadcast the brief public moments of the ceremony to audiences around the world. The balance between public interest and family privacy had been carefully negotiated in the weeks leading up to the baptism, with palace officials working closely with media representatives to ensure appropriate coverage without overwhelming the intimate nature of the occasion. As their car approached the palace gates, Catherine could see familiar faces beginning to arrive. Her sister Pippa stepped out of a taxi, elegant in a navy blue dress and coordinating fascinator, followed by their brother James, who looked slightly overwhelmed by the formal nature of the occasion despite having attended the royal wedding just 2 years earlier. The Middleton family's presence at such a significant royal ceremony still felt remarkable to Catherine, a testament to how thoroughly her family had been embraced by the royal household. Prince Harry bounded up the palace steps with his characteristic energy, having arrived from a military engagement that had kept him busy until the last possible moment. At 28, he brought a sense of informal warmth to royal occasions that complemented his brother's more serious approach to duty. He had been genuinely excited about becoming an uncle, often joking to friends that he looked forward to being the fun relative who could spoil George and then return him to his parents when things got difficult. The Queen's arrival marked a shift in the morning's atmosphere. Her burgundy Bentley pulled through the gates with ceremonial precision, and she emerged wearing her powder blue coat and a matching hat adorned with subtle feather details. At 87, she moved with the careful grace of someone conscious of both her age and her position, but her genuine pleasure at the occasion was evident in the slight smile that played at the corners of her mouth as she greeted arriving guests. Prince Charles had walked over from Clarence House, his nearby residence, making the short journey convenient. He carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man anticipating a joyful family occasion, though he remained conscious of the constitutional significance of the moment. As the baby's grandfather and the heir apparent, Charles understood that this baptism represented continuity, not just of family traditions, but of the monarchy itself stretching forward into another generation. Inside the Chapel Royal, the final preparations were reaching completion. The lily font had been positioned at the center of the chapel, its ornate silver surface gleaming under the warm light filtering through stained glass windows. The Archbishop of Canterbury reviewed his notes one final time, conscious that his words would be scrutinized not just by the immediate congregation, but by observers around the world who would analyze every aspect of the ceremony. The chapel itself held centuries of history within its circular walls. Built by Henry VIII, it had witnessed royal weddings, christenings, and funerals for nearly 500 years. The ornate ceiling, painted in rich blues and golds, seemed to hover over the intimate space like a canopy of royal heritage. 22 chairs had been arranged in a semicircle around the font, each position carefully assigned to reflect both family hierarchy and personal relationships. Catherine's parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, arrived with the quiet dignity they had maintained throughout their daughter's transition into royal life. Michael, typically practical, carried a small camera, one of the few personal recording devices that would be allowed in the chapel. Carol wore a pale pink dress and jacket that complemented without competing with the other guests' attire, her natural elegance enhanced by the significance of the moment. The Middleton grandparents had also been included in the guest list, a gesture that reflected both William and Catherine's commitment to maintaining family connections and the royal family's recognition of how thoroughly the two families had merged. Their presence added a warmth to the occasion that balanced the formal protocol surrounding the ceremony. As the Cambridge family's car pulled into the palace courtyard, a small crowd of household staff had gathered to witness their arrival. Many had worked for the royal family for decades and understood the historical significance of the moment they were witnessing. The birth of a new heir always carried special meaning for those whose professional lives were dedicated to supporting the monarchy, representing both continuity and renewal in an institution built on tradition. William stepped out of the car first, immediately moving to Catherine's side as she carefully emerged with George in her arms. The baby, now fully awake, seemed to take in his surroundings with the alert curiosity typical of 3-month-old children. His christening gown caught the morning breeze, the delicate lace seeming to flutter like small wings as Catherine walked toward the chapel entrance. The assembled photographers captured the moment with professional efficiency, their cameras clicking in a synchronized rhythm that would have seemed overwhelming to casual observers, but felt routine to the royal family. George, perhaps responding to the sound or simply content in his mother's arms, remained calm throughout the brief walk from car to chapel door. Inside the chapel, the soft murmur of conversation indicated that most guests had already assembled. The intimate nature of the gathering meant that every person present held genuine significance in either George's life or the life of his parents. There were no distant dignitaries or political figures, only family members, close friends, and the religious officials necessary to perform the ceremony. As Catherine carried George through the chapel doors, the conversations gradually quieted. The moment had arrived to welcome officially the third in line to the British throne into the Christian faith, in a ceremony that would blend ancient traditions with contemporary family dynamics, watched by a small congregation, but followed by millions around the world. The chapel royal fell into a reverent hush as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, took his position beside the ornate lily font. Sunlight streamed through the ancient stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the circular space where centuries of royal history had unfolded. The water in the font had been brought specially from the River Jordan, connecting this modern ceremony to the biblical traditions that formed the foundation of Christian baptism. Catherine stood beside the font, George nestled securely in her arms, while William positioned himself at her side. The baby's christening gown, with its intricate Huntington lace and flowing silk train, seemed to glow in the chapel's warm light. George remained remarkably calm, his dark eyes moving curiously between the faces gathered around him and the unfamiliar surroundings of the historic chapel. The Queen sat in the front row, her presence lending both gravitas and warmth to the occasion. At 87, she had witnessed countless family baptisms, but this one held special significance as it marked another step in securing the succession that would carry the monarchy forward. Beside her, Prince Philip, despite his advancing age, maintained the alert bearing that had characterized his decades of royal service. Prince Charles watched with evident emotion as his first grandchild prepared to receive the sacrament that would formally welcome him into the Church of England. As the future supreme governor of that church, Charles understood the constitutional importance of the moment, but his focus remained on the family significance of welcoming George into their faith tradition. Archbishop Welby began the service with the traditional words that had echoed through British churches for generations. His voice, clear and resonant in the intimate space, carried both authority and warmth as he addressed the small congregation. Dearly beloved, we have come together to witness and celebrate the gift of new life in George Alexander Lewis, and to welcome him into the fellowship of faith. The familiar liturgy unfolded with measured dignity, each word carrying the weight of tradition while addressing the very modern reality of baptizing a future king in an age of global media attention. Welby had spent considerable time preparing for this moment, conscious that his words would be analyzed and remembered long after the ceremony concluded. Catherine's voice was steady, but soft as she and William responded to the Archbishop's questions about their commitment to raising George in the Christian faith. The promises they made echoed those spoken by countless parents throughout history, but carried additional weight given their son's future role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. Will you pray for him, draw him by your example into the community of faith, and walk with him in the way of Christ? Welby asked. William and Catherine's unified response of, with the help of God, we will seem to resonate through the chapel with particular significance. The godparents stepped forward as their names were called. Oliver Baker, a close friend from William's school days, stood alongside Amelia Jardine Patterson, who had been a friend of Catherine since childhood. Earl Grosvenor, representing the aristocratic connections that remained part of royal tradition, joined Jamie Lowther Pinkerton, William's former private secretary, who had become a trusted family friend. Julius Samuel, a psychotherapist and close friend of Princess Diana, completed the group of godparents, her presence serving as a touching connection to William's late mother. Each godparent spoke their commitment to support George's spiritual development, their voices blending in the ancient promises that bound them to play active roles in the young prince's religious upbringing. The selection of godparents had been carefully considered, balancing personal friendships with the traditional expectations surrounding royal baptisms. As the moment for the actual baptism approached, George seemed to sense the heightened attention focused on him. He remained calm, but alert, his gaze moving between his parents and the Archbishop. Catherine adjusted his position slightly, ensuring the christening gown was perfectly arranged for the photographs that would document this historic moment. Archbishop Welby approached the font and began the prayer of blessing over the water. We thank you, Father, for the water of baptism. In it we are buried with Christ in his death. By it we share in his resurrection. Through it we are reborn by the Holy Spirit. The ancient words seemed to carry additional resonance in the historic chapel where they had been spoken over royal children for centuries. The moment of baptism itself unfolded with gentle solemnity. Welby carefully cupped the blessed water in his hands and poured it 3 times over George's head, speaking the traditional formula. George Alexander Lewis, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The baby started slightly at the touch of the water, but settled quickly back into Catherine's arms. The congregation responded with Amen, their voices creating a moment of unified witness to the sacrament they had just observed. Prince Harry grinned broadly from his seat, clearly delighted by his new nephew's composed behavior throughout the ceremony. The Middleton grandparents watched with obvious pride, still somewhat amazed to find themselves present at such a significant royal occasion. Following the baptism, Archbishop Welby made the sign of the cross on George's forehead, saying, Christ claims you for his own. Receive the sign of his cross. The gesture, simple but profound, marked George's formal entry into the Christian faith and the Church of England that he would one day lead. The service continued with prayers for George's future, asking for divine guidance as he grew into his role as a member of the royal family and, eventually, as king. The prayers, while traditional in form, took on contemporary relevance given the modern challenges facing the monarchy and the changing nature of Britain itself. A reading from the Gospel of Luke provided the scriptural foundation for the ceremony, with a familiar passage about Jesus welcoming children serving as a reminder that even future kings began their spiritual journey as small children dependent on their parents' faith and guidance. As the formal ceremony concluded, the congregation rose for a hymn that filled the circular chapel with voices raised in celebration. The Queen's clear soprano could be heard among the others, a reminder of her own deep faith and the personal meaning these ceremonies held for her beyond their constitutional significance. The final blessing pronounced by Archbishop Welby brought the service to its conclusion, but the sense of celebration and family unity continued to fill the chapel. George, having slept through portions of the ceremony, seemed perfectly content in his mother's arms, unaware that he had just participated in a ritual that connected him to centuries of royal tradition and Christian heritage. As the congregation began to move toward the chapel doors, Catherine and William shared a quiet moment of gratitude for the peaceful ceremony and the safe completion of this important milestone in their son's young life. The formal requirements had been fulfilled, but more importantly, they had welcomed their child into their faith community, surrounded by the people who mattered most to them. As the chapel doors opened, the small congregation emerged into the bright October sunshine that bathed the courtyard of St. James's Palace. The contrast between the intimate, sacred atmosphere inside and the waiting world outside created a moment of transition that the royal family navigated with practiced grace. George, still cradled in Catherine's arms, blinked in the natural light, his christening gown catching the breeze in a way that made the delicate lace seem to dance. The official photographs began immediately, but with a restraint that reflected the family's desire to balance public interest with personal privacy. Jason Bell, the renowned photographer chosen for this assignment, worked with quiet efficiency to capture both formal portraits and candid moments that would document this historic day. His experience with royal photography allowed him to work quickly while still achieving the artistic quality expected for such significant images. The Queen positioned herself at the center of the first formal group photograph, her powder blue coat creating a perfect complement to Catherine's cream ensemble. 4 generations of the royal family arranged themselves naturally around the lily font, which had been moved to provide an appropriate backdrop for the pictures. George seemed fascinated by the camera's clicking sounds, his attention focused intently on the photographer's movements. Prince Charles stood behind his mother, one hand resting gently on her shoulder in a gesture that spoke to both filial affection and constitutional continuity. The image captured not just a family moment, but a visualization of a line of succession stretching forward into the future. William, holding George now, seemed conscious of representing the bridge between his father generation and his son's uncertain but promising future. The godparents gathered for their own photographs, their faces showing the mix of pride and responsibility that came with their new roles. Julius Samuel's presence seemed particularly meaningful to William, representing not just personal friendship, but a connection to his mother's memory on this important day. Diana's absence was felt but not discussed, her presence acknowledged through the choice of godmother and the continuation of family traditions she would have cherished. Catherine's parents stood with obvious pride as Michael's small camera captured personal family moments alongside the official photography. Carol Middleton's natural ease in front of cameras served her well as she helped coordinate the various group configurations required for the formal portraits. The inclusion of both sets of grandparents in the official photographs reflected the modern royal family's recognition of extended family relationships. Between formal shots, informal moments unfolded that revealed the genuine warmth within the royal family. Prince Harry made faces at George, eliciting what might have been the baby's first smile during the photography session. The Queen, despite her formal bearing in official portraits, was observed speaking softly to her great-grandson, her expression softening in ways that reminded observers of her role not just as sovereign but as great-grandmother. The Middleton family's presence throughout the photography session illustrated how thoroughly they had been integrated into royal occasions. Pippa's natural grace and James's growing comfort with royal protocol showed how successfully Catherine's family had adapted to their unique position within the extended royal household. Their inclusion in formal photographs would ensure that George would grow up with visual reminders of both sides of his heritage. As the photography concluded, the family moved toward the palace's state apartments for a private reception. The guest list remained deliberately small, allowing for genuine conversation and celebration rather than the formal exchanges that characterized larger royal gatherings. The intimate nature of the reception reflected William and Catherine's approach to royal life, fulfilling their public duties while maintaining authentic personal relationships. Inside the elegantly appointed reception room, household staff had prepared a traditional christening cake alongside lighter refreshments appropriate for the late morning timing. The cake, created by the palace pastry chefs, featured delicate sugarwork that echoed the lace patterns of George's christening gown. Prince Charles, known for his appreciation of traditional craftsmanship, examined the cake's decorative details with obvious pleasure. Conversation flowed easily among the small gathering, with topics ranging from George's development to upcoming royal engagements to family plans for the approaching Christmas season. The Queen, despite her formal public image, showed particular interest in discussing George's sleeping patterns and eating habits, grandmother concerns that transcended royal protocol. Archbishop Welby circulated among the guests, his presence serving as a reminder of the spiritual significance underlying the day's celebrations. His conversations with family members revealed both his pastoral care and his understanding of the unique pressures facing the royal family in their public roles. His relatively recent appointment to Canterbury meant that these relationships were still developing, but his warmth and intelligence were already making positive impressions. Catherine found herself in conversation with Julius Samuel, Diana's friend whose selection as godmother had been both personal and symbolic. Their discussion touched on the challenges of raising children in the public eye, with Julia's professional background as a psychotherapist providing insights that Catherine found particularly valuable. The conversation represented the kind of support network Catherine was building as she navigated motherhood under intense scrutiny. William spent time with his military friends among the godparents, discussing both current events and shared memories from their service together. These relationships, forged through shared experiences rather than royal connection, provided him with perspectives and friendships that remained grounded in his pre-royal identity. The informal nature of these conversations contrasted sharply with his more formal interactions during official engagements. George himself remained remarkably well-behaved throughout the reception, passing from one family member to another with the adaptability that would serve him well in his future public role. His great-grandmother held him with the confident ease of someone who had raised 4 children and welcomed numerous grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Her obvious pleasure in these moments reminded observers that beneath the constitutional significance lay genuine family bonds. The reception's timing allowed guests to depart before the afternoon rush, while giving family members adequate time to celebrate and connect. The Middleton family's comfort in royal surroundings had grown considerably since Catherine's engagement, and their natural warmth continued to complement the more formal aspects of royal gatherings. As the reception wound down, individual family members began taking their leave with the quiet efficiency that characterized royal gatherings. Prince Charles paused to speak privately with William and Catherine, offering both congratulations and grandfather's advice about the early stages of parenthood. His obvious delight in his new role as grandfather added a personal dimension to their constitutional relationship. The Queen's departure marked the formal conclusion of the reception, though close family members lingered for a few additional minutes of private celebration. Her brief but warm words to William and Catherine expressed both official approval and personal affection, encapsulating her dual role as both sovereign and great-grandmother. As the official guests departed, Catherine and William found themselves with a few quiet moments to reflect on the successful completion of George's baptism. The ceremony had achieved its multiple objectives, fulfilling constitutional requirements, maintaining family traditions, satisfying public interest, and, most importantly, welcoming their son into their faith community, surrounded by people who cared about his well-being. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the courtyard of St. James's Palace, William and Catherine prepared for their return journey to Kensington Palace. George, now showing signs of the exhaustion that follows any major event in a baby's life, nestled contentedly against his mother's shoulder. The christening gown, which had maintained its pristine appearance throughout the ceremony and reception, would soon be carefully preserved alongside its historic predecessor, waiting for future generations of royal babies. The drive back through London provided the family with their first opportunity to reflect privately on the morning's events. Catherine gazed out at the familiar streets, still processing the realization that her 3-month-old son had just participated in a ceremony connecting him to centuries of British royal tradition. The weight of that connection felt both humbling and inspiring as she considered the path that lay ahead for George. William found himself thinking about his own baptism in the same chapel 31 years earlier, wondering what his parents had felt during that ceremony and what hopes they had harbored for his future. The cyclical nature of royal life, the repetition of ancient rituals with each new generation, struck him with particular force as he watched his son sleeping peacefully after his first major public appearance. Back at Kensington Palace, the relative quiet felt almost jarring after the morning's carefully orchestrated events. The palace staff, who had been monitoring news coverage throughout the day, reported overwhelmingly positive public response to the ceremony and the official photographs. Social media had been filled with commentary about George's good behavior, the beauty of the christening gown, and the obvious happiness of the royal family. International coverage had been extensive, with news outlets around the world featuring the baptism as their lead story. The images of 4 generations of royalty gathered around the historic font would be reproduced in newspapers and magazines for years to come, serving as a visual representation of the monarchy's continuity and stability. The careful balance between tradition and modernity that characterized the ceremony had resonated with audiences both in Britain and internationally. Catherine's parents lingered for a while after returning to the palace, sharing their own reflections on the day's significance. Michael Middleton's photographs, taken with permission during the reception, would become treasured family mementos that captured informal moments not recorded by the official photographer. Carol's practical nature expressed itself in her insistence on helping Catherine settle George for his afternoon nap, grandmother instincts overriding any protocol considerations. The christening gifts, which had been arriving at the palace for weeks, represented a fascinating cross-section of contemporary royal gift-giving. Traditional silver items from established jewelers sat alongside handmade pieces from craft organizations that Catherine patronized. Children's charities had sent books and toys, while various Commonwealth governments had contributed items reflecting their cultural heritage and connection to the British Crown. Among the most treasured gifts were those with personal significance. A hand-knitted blanket from a women's organization Catherine supported, a silver cup engraved with George's birth details from his godparents, and a collection of children's books selected by Julia Samuel that reflected her memories of Diana's reading preferences. These personal touches balanced the formal presentations from diplomatic sources and official organizations. The evening news broadcasts led with coverage of the baptism, featuring commentary from royal historians who placed the day's events in their proper constitutional context. The ceremony marked not just a family milestone, but a constitutional moment, formally welcoming the third in line to the throne into the church he would someday lead. The historical parallels drawn by commentators helped viewers understand the significance of what they had witnessed. Religious leaders from various denominations offered positive commentary about the ceremony, praising Archbishop Welby's handling of the service and the royal family's demonstration of their Christian faith. The baptism served as a reminder of the Church of England's central role in British constitutional life, and the monarchy's function as a link between religious tradition and contemporary governance. As evening approached, William and Catherine found themselves in the nursery, watching George sleep in his cot. The christening gown had been carefully removed and would be cleaned and preserved according to strict conservation protocols. In its place, George wore simple pajamas that emphasized his essential humanity beneath all the royal ceremony and constitutional significance. The couple's conversation touched on their hopes for George's future, acknowledging both the extraordinary opportunities and unique pressures that would shape his life. They spoke about their desire to provide him with as normal a childhood as possible while preparing him for the responsibilities he would eventually inherit. The balance between these competing goals would define much of their parenting approach in the years ahead. Catherine reflected on how much her life had changed since her own childhood in Bucklebury, wondering what her younger self would have thought about participating in such ancient ceremonies with such historic significance. The journey from middle-class family life to royal responsibilities continued to amaze her, particularly as she considered how George would grow up taking such ceremonial occasions for granted. William's thoughts turned to his mother, wishing Diana could have been present to witness her grandson's baptism. He had felt her absence particularly keenly during the ceremony, though her memory had been honored through the selection of Julia Samuel as godmother and the inclusion of friends who had known and loved Diana. The continuation of family traditions felt like both tribute and progression. The successful completion of George's baptism marked another milestone in the young family's adaptation to royal life. Each major event, the birth announcement, the first public photographs, today's ceremony, had been navigated successfully, building confidence for the challenges that lay ahead. The positive public response reinforced their belief that they were finding the right balance between accessibility and dignity. As the palace settled into evening quiet, the day's events had already taken their place in the long history of British royal ceremonies. The photographs would join countless others in the royal archives, the guest list would be preserved for future historians, and the ceremony itself would be remembered as another successful milestone in the Windsor dynasty's ongoing story. George's baptism had achieved its multiple purposes: constitutional, religious, and personal. The future king had been welcomed into the Church of England. The royal family had demonstrated its commitment to tradition and faith, and, most importantly, a small child had been surrounded by love and prayer as he began his spiritual journey. In the years ahead, as George grew into his role and responsibilities, this day would be remembered as the formal beginning of his preparation for the crown that would someday be his to wear.